The piano keys struck a melancholy tune as Ruby Mae Callahan stepped down from the creaking staircase of the $Silver Saloon, her emerald dress catching the lamplight in ways that drew every eye in the smoky room. But behind the painted smile and practiced sway of her hips lay a desperation so profound that when she whispered those 5 words to the young man in the corner, words that would shatter every assumption about fallen women and righteous men, his response would change not just her life, but the entire town of Deadwood Creek, Colorado. What he said next would challenge everything the God-fearing community believed about redemption, second chances, and who deserved salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ruby Mae Callahan had never intended to become the kind of woman mothers warned their daughters about. 3 years ago, she'd been Margaret Ruby Callahan, a 19-year-old schoolteacher from Springfield, Missouri, with dreams of educating frontier children and building a respectable life in the growing territories of the American West. Her father, Benjamin Callahan, had been a respected banker who'd raised her with proper values, classical literature, and the firm belief that education could lift anyone from humble circumstances to dignified prosperity. The typhoid epidemic that swept through Springfield in the winter of 1884 had claimed both her parents within 2 weeks of each other, leaving Margaret with nothing but debts, a foreclosed family home, and a teaching certificate that proved worthless when the school board decided a young woman without family connections couldn't maintain proper moral authority over their children. With $17 to her name and nowhere to turn, she'd answered an advertisement for refined ladies to work in a Colorado establishment that promised respectable employment and comfortable accommodations. The deception had become apparent the moment she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Deadwood Creek and been met by Silas Montgomery, the $Silver Saloon's owner, a man whose gold teeth and predatory smile should have warned her that respectable employment had nothing to do with serving drinks and everything to do with serving men's baser desires. By then, she'd spent her last money on the stagecoach fare and had no means of returning home, even if home had still existed. "You got 2 choices, Missy," Montgomery had informed her that first night as she'd stood in the saloon's back room, still wearing her modest traveling dress and clutching her teaching satchel like a shield. "You can work upstairs entertaining the gentlemen, or you can work in the kitchen washing dishes for scraps. But either way, you owe me for transportation, room and board. And that debt's gonna take a long time to work off." The mathematics of her situation had been brutally simple. Kitchen work paid $2 a week minus room and board costs that Montgomery calculated at $3 weekly. Working upstairs paid $5 a night, with Montgomery taking half and charging the same room and board fees. Neither option offered any path to freedom, but only one provided enough income to eventually buy her way out of servitude. She'd chosen survival over principles, though the decision had cost her something more valuable than money. Margaret Ruby Callahan had died that night, replaced by Ruby Mae, a woman who learned to paint her face, cinch her waist, and smile while men touched her with hands that smelled of whiskey and tobacco. She'd become skilled at separating her mind from her body during those transactions, retreating into memories of teaching children their letters or reciting poetry her father had made her memorize. The transformation hadn't been immediate. For months, she'd clung to the belief that her situation was temporary, that she'd save enough money to escape and reclaim her former identity. She'd written letters to distant relatives who never responded, inquired about teaching positions in other towns that were never available, and maintained the hope that somehow she could return to respectability. But Deadwood Creek was a mining town where secrets were impossible to keep and reputations were permanent stains. Word of her employment at the Silver had spread through the community faster than gossip at a church social, ensuring that no respectable family would hire her as a governess. No school board would consider her for teaching positions. and no decent man would court her for marriage. The realization that she was trapped had come gradually, like a slow-acting poison that destroyed hope one drop at a time. Men who visited the saloon treated her with a mixture of desire and contempt, wanting her services while despising her for providing them. Women in town crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her presence, as if her mere existence threatened their own moral standing. Even the other girls who worked at the Silver Dollar maintained emotional distance, protecting themselves from attachments that might make their circumstances more painful. Ruby May had learned to navigate this world with careful attention to unspoken rules that governed her survival. She was friendly, but not familiar with the customers, professional, but not cold, attractive enough to generate income, but not beautiful enough to inspire dangerous obsessions. She developed relationships with certain regular customers who treated her with relative kindness: the lonely widower who paid her to sit and talk about his deceased wife, the young cowboy who was too shy to do more than hold her hand, the traveling salesman who hired her company, just to have someone listen to his stories. These interactions had sustained her emotionally, while the accumulating money provided the practical hope of eventual escape. Montgomery's accounting was deliberately opaque, with charges for laundry, meals, medical care, and various administrative fees that kept her debt growing despite steady payments. But Ruby May had learned to keep her own records, hiding small amounts of money whenever possible, and calculating that she needed approximately $200 to buy her freedom and establish herself somewhere else under a new identity. The closest she'd come to escape had been 6 months earlier, when a traveling preacher named Jeremiah Whitmore had arrived in Deadwood Creek for a week-long revival meeting. His sermons about redemption and God's infinite mercy had stirred something in her soul that she'd thought was permanently buried. After one particularly powerful evening service about Mary Magdalene's transformation from sinner to saint, Ruby May had approached Reverend Whitmore with a carefully worded request for spiritual counsel. "Reverend," she'd said, meeting him outside the canvas tent where he'd been holding services, "I've heard your sermons about God's forgiveness. Do you believe that applies to all sinners, regardless of their particular transgressions?" Whitmore had been a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and hands worn from manual labor before his calling to ministry. He'd studied her face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading human desperation. "Child," he'd replied gently, "God's mercy is infinite, but his children must be willing to turn away from sin and embrace righteous living. The question isn't whether God can forgive, but whether the sinner is truly ready to change. And if someone wanted to change but was trapped by circumstances beyond their control, if they had debts that kept them bound to sinful employment." Whitmore's expression had grown troubled as he'd begun to understand the nature of her situation. "There are charitable organizations, missions that help women in difficult circumstances. But such help requires complete honesty about one's situation and genuine commitment to moral transformation." Ruby May had felt hope flickering in her chest like a candle flame in a drafty room. "Would you be willing to help someone in such circumstances, Reverend? To write letters of recommendation or provide assistance in relocating to a place where they could start fresh?" The preacher had hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ruby May had seen the death of her hopes. Even a man dedicated to preaching God's mercy was unwilling to risk his reputation by associating with a woman of her profession. "I would pray for such a person," he'd said finally, "and I would encourage them to seek help from the appropriate charitable institutions. But my ministry requires me to maintain certain standards of association to preserve my effectiveness in reaching souls." The rejection had been delivered kindly, but it had shattered Ruby May's last illusions about the possibility of redemption. If a preacher who spoke eloquently about God's forgiveness couldn't risk helping a fallen woman, then no one in respectable society ever would. That conversation had occurred on a Tuesday evening in April. By Friday, Reverend Whitmore had completed his revival meeting and departed for the next town on his circuit, leaving Ruby May with the bitter understanding that salvation was available to everyone except those who needed it most desperately. The months that followed had been marked by a gradual hardening of her heart and a systematic abandonment of hope. She'd stopped attending church services, even from the back pew where she'd occasionally sat during her early months in Deadwood Creek. She'd ceased her letter-writing attempts to find respectable employment elsewhere. Most importantly, she'd begun drinking laudanum to numb the emotional pain that threatened to overwhelm her during her darkest moments. The laudanum had been Montgomery's suggestion, offered with the false kindness of a man who profited from women's desperation. "Helps the girls get through the rough nights," he'd explained, providing small bottles of the opium-laced medicine at prices that ensured her debt continued growing. "Makes the work easier to bear." What Montgomery hadn't mentioned was how quickly the medicine became necessary rather than helpful, how the doses required to achieve numbness increased steadily, and how the craving for relief became another chain binding her to the silver dollar. Within weeks, Ruby May had found herself dependent not just on the income from her work, but on the medicine that made the work bearable. It was this double trap, financial debt and physical dependency, that had brought her to the evening of October 15th, 1887, when she discovered that Montgomery intended to sell her contract to a brothel owner in Denver who specialized in experienced girls willing to service the most degraded customers. The conversation she'd overheard between Montgomery and the Denver procurer had made clear that her useful life in Deadwood Creek was ending, and her future would involve even worse circumstances in a larger city where she'd have no protection and no hope of escape. That night, as she'd sat in her small room above the saloon, counting the $43 she'd managed to save despite Montgomery's accounting manipulations, Ruby May had finally reached the breaking point that had been building for 3 years. She was 22 years old, addicted to laudanum, trapped in debt to a man who viewed her as livestock, and facing transportation to circumstances that would likely end with her death in some Denver alley within a year. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she'd gotten down on her knees and prayed with the desperate intensity of someone who'd exhausted all earthly options. Not the careful, proper prayers of her church upbringing, but the raw pleading of a soul confronting its own destruction. "God," she'd whispered into the darkness of her room, "I know I've sinned. I know I've fallen so far that decent people won't even look at me. But if you still care about lost souls, if there's any chance of redemption for someone like me, please send me a sign. Show me a way out of this hell that I can't find on my own." She'd remained on her knees until dawn, but no miraculous intervention had occurred. No angel had appeared with instructions for escape. No wealthy benefactor had arrived to pay her debts and transport her to safety. The only sound had been the snoring of Montgomery in the room below and the occasional laughter of late-night customers in the saloon. As the sun had risen over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded her of better times, Ruby May had made a decision that she'd known might be her last. If God wouldn't provide a miracle, she'd create one herself, even if it meant risking everything she had left. The plan that had formed in her desperation was simple and dangerous. She would approach every respectable man in Deadwood Creek with an offer that challenged their Christian values. She would trade her savings, her service, and her complete submission for marriage and the protection of a legitimate name. Not love, not romance, but a business arrangement that offered her legal protection from Montgomery while providing a husband. With domestic service and whatever physical comfort he required, the offer would scandalize the town and likely result in her being driven out of Deadwood Creek entirely. But being expelled from the community would at least break Montgomery's hold over her. And being married would provide legal protections that a single woman couldn't claim. Ruby May had spent 3 days identifying potential candidates, men who were unmarried, financially stable enough to absorb her debts, and desperate enough for domestic companionship to consider an arrangement with a fallen woman. The list had been discouragingly short: a widowed storekeeper with 3 young children, an aging rancher whose wife had died in childbirth, and 2 unmarried brothers who ran a successful mining operation, but had never found wives willing to live in their remote claim. Each approach had ended in humiliating rejection. The storekeeper had listened to her proposal with growing horror before ordering her to leave his establishment and never return. The rancher had laughed cruelly and suggested that if he wanted a whore, he could rent one by the hour rather than supporting one permanently. The mining brothers had been interested in her physical services, but unwilling to offer marriage or legal protection in exchange. By the evening of October 18th, Ruby May had exhausted her list of potential salvation and was facing the reality that Montgomery intended to ship her to Denver within the week. Her remaining options were limited to running away with $43 and no destination, or accepting transportation to a brothel that would likely kill her. Within a year, it was in this state of absolute desperation that she'd noticed the young man sitting alone in the corner of the Silver Dollar's main room, nursing a single whiskey and reading what appeared to be a leather-bound Bible. He was perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed uncomfortable with the saloon's atmosphere. His clothes were clean but modest, suggesting steady employment without wealth. Most importantly, he wore no wedding ring and seemed unaccompanied by friends or associates. For 2 hours, Ruby May had watched him read while occasionally glancing around the room with the cautious air of someone who didn't belong in such an establishment. He'd politely declined approaches from the other girls, paid for his drink without complaint, and shown none of the aggressive behavior that characterized most saloon customers. When Montgomery had finally demanded that she either approach the stranger or return to her room for the night, Ruby May had made a decision that would change her life forever. She would make her desperate proposal to this Bible-reading stranger, gambling everything on the possibility that a man who brought religious texts to saloons might possess compassion that other respectable men had lacked. As she'd crossed the smoky room toward his corner table, Ruby May had offered a prayer more desperate than any she'd ever uttered. God, if you're listening, let this man have mercy on a lost soul. Let him see something worth saving in a woman who's forgotten how to save herself. The young man had looked up from his Bible as she'd approached, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of curiosity rather than the usual mixture of desire and contempt she'd learned to expect from customers. In that moment, Ruby May had realized that she was about to risk everything on a stranger's capacity for redemption, both his willingness to offer it and her ability to prove worthy of receiving it. What happened next would determine whether Margaret Ruby Callahan could be resurrected from the ashes of Ruby May's fall, or whether this final gamble would complete her destruction in the most public and humiliating way possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The young man's name was Samuel Nathaniel Thornbrook, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity that marked him as a preacher's son even before Ruby May learned his identity. At 26, he possessed the kind of face that suggested both intelligence and compassion, features that had been shaped by extensive education and genuine concern for human suffering. His presence in the Silver Dollar Saloon represented the most profound crisis of faith he'd ever experienced. Though none of the establishment's patrons could have guessed the internal battle raging beneath his composed exterior, Samuel had arrived in Deadwood Creek 3 weeks earlier as the newly appointed assistant pastor of the First Presbyterian Church, called to serve under Reverend Augustus McKinnon, a stern man of 68, who believed that moral authority required unwavering distance from sin in all its manifestations. The church board had selected Samuel specifically because his theological training at Princeton Seminary and his spotless reputation seemed to guarantee that he would maintain the community's strict standards of righteousness while bringing youthful energy to their spiritual leadership. What the church board hadn't anticipated was Samuel's private struggle with the doctrine of predestination that formed the cornerstone of Presbyterian theology. His seminary education had taught him that salvation was predetermined by divine will, that the elect were chosen before birth, and that no amount of good works could alter God's judgment about human souls. But his personal study of Scripture, particularly the New Testament accounts of Christ's interactions with prostitutes, tax collectors, and other social outcasts, had filled him with troubling questions about the practical application of theological theory. The crisis had begun during his first week in Deadwood Creek, when he'd visited the homes of his new congregation to introduce himself and assess their spiritual needs. The comfortable middle-class families who comprised the church membership had welcomed him warmly, sharing their concerns about the moral decline they perceived in their community. Without exception, they'd expressed particular alarm about the Silver Dollar Saloon and its corrupting influence on the town's moral atmosphere. "Those women are beyond redemption," Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, the church organist, had declared during his pastoral visit to her well-appointed home. "They've chosen their path, and decent people shouldn't contaminate themselves by association with such creatures. The Bible is clear about avoiding the appearance of evil." Similar sentiments had been expressed by every family he'd visited, creating a unanimous consensus among his congregation that the women who worked at the saloon were irredeemably lost souls who threatened the spiritual welfare of respectable citizens. The consistency of these opinions had troubled Samuel, not because he disagreed with the moral condemnation of prostitution, but because the absolute nature of their judgment seemed to contradict Christ's teachings about mercy and redemption. His theological training had equipped him with extensive knowledge of biblical precedents for Christ's ministry to social outcasts, but his practical experience with pastoral care had been limited to seminary exercises and supervised visits to respectable families. The disconnect between theoretical knowledge and real-world application had become a source of increasing anxiety as he'd struggled to reconcile his congregation's expectations with his own understanding of Christian compassion. The internal conflict had intensified when he'd encountered Ruby May during his second week in town. He'd been walking past the Silver Dollar on his way to visit a sick parishioner when she'd emerged from the establishment in broad daylight, wearing a blue dress that was modest by saloon standards, but still revealed more of her figure than respectable women would display in public. Their eyes had met briefly across the dusty street, and Samuel had seen something in her expression that had haunted him for days afterward. It hadn't been the brazen confidence he'd expected from a woman of her profession, nor the hardened indifference that moral reformers described as characteristic of fallen women. Instead, he'd glimpsed what appeared to be profound sadness mixed with desperate hope, as if she was searching for something she'd lost and feared she might never find. Again, that momentary encounter had triggered weeks of spiritual wrestling as Samuel had attempted to understand his role as a Christian minister in a community that included both the righteous and the fallen. His nightly prayers had become extended sessions of questioning rather than peaceful communion with the divine, as he'd struggled to determine whether his calling required him to maintain the safe distance that his congregation expected or to risk the kind of direct ministry that Christ had demonstrated in the Gospels. The crisis had reached its peak 3 days earlier when Reverend McKinnon had delivered a sermon about the wheat and the tares, emphasizing God's ultimate separation of the righteous from the wicked. The elderly pastor's interpretation had focused on the importance of avoiding contamination by sinful influences, arguing that true Christians were called to maintain their purity by avoiding association with those who had chosen paths of moral corruption. "We cannot save those who refuse salvation," McKinnon had declared from the pulpit, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in ministry. Our responsibility is to maintain our own righteousness and to protect our families from corrupting influences. God has already determined who belongs to the elect, and it is not our place to question his divine judgment. The sermon had been enthusiastically received by the congregation, but it had left Samuel feeling spiritually hollow. If salvation was predetermined and the fallen were beyond help, then what was the purpose of Christian ministry beyond maintaining comfortable social boundaries? If God's mercy was limited to those who were already righteous, then how could the gospel be considered good news for anyone who genuinely needed transformation? These questions had driven Samuel to seek solitude for prayer and study, but instead of finding answers in the familiar passages he'd memorized during seminary, he'd found himself drawn to the more challenging texts that his professors had discussed as theological mysteries. The story of the woman caught in adultery, Christ's dinner with tax collectors and sinners, the parable of the lost sheep, all seemed to suggest a divine love that actively pursued the fallen, rather than simply waiting for them to demonstrate their worthiness. On the evening of October 18th, Samuel's spiritual crisis had reached a breaking point that demanded resolution through direct action rather than continued theoretical contemplation. He'd made a decision that would have horrified his congregation and disappointed his mentor. He would visit the $Silver Saloon, not to condemn or convert, but to observe and understand the reality of the people his church had written off as irredeemable. His intention hadn't been to minister or preach, but simply to witness the humanity of those whom respectable society had labeled as beyond divine mercy. He'd brought his Bible not as a weapon of moral judgment, but as a source of comfort for his own uncertainty about the boundaries of Christian compassion. The atmosphere inside the $Silver had been everything his congregation had warned him to expect: smoky, loud, and saturated with the kind of worldliness that made comfortable Christians uncomfortable. But Samuel had also observed details that challenged his preconceptions about the establishment and its inhabitants. The women who worked there treated each other with genuine affection, sharing quiet conversations and looking after those who seemed distressed. The customers, while often crude and intoxicated, included men he recognized from the community, fathers and husbands who presented very different faces in church and social settings. Most significantly, Samuel had noticed the careful, emotional distance that the women maintained even during their most intimate professional interactions. They performed their roles with practiced skill, but their eyes remained guarded, suggesting depths of experience and feeling that their public personas were designed to conceal. He'd been reading the Gospel of Luke, specifically the account of Christ's anointing by a sinful woman, when Ruby May had begun her approach across the saloon floor. Something in her movement, a combination of determination and desperation, had alerted him that this encounter would be different from the polite rejections he'd witnessed her colleagues extend to other customers as she'd drawn nearer. Samuel had found himself studying her face with the careful attention he usually reserved for biblical texts. Her features were undeniably beautiful, but it was a beauty marked by experiences that had aged her beyond her years. Her eyes held intelligence that seemed inconsistent with the stereotypes about fallen women, and her manner suggested education that raised questions about how she'd arrived at her current circumstances. "Excuse me?" Ruby May had said, stopping beside his table with her hands clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl, preparing to recite a lesson. "I hope I'm not disturbing your reading." Her voice had carried traces of refined speech that suggested better origins than her current profession would indicate. Samuel had closed his Bible carefully, marking his place with the ribbon bookmark his mother had sewn for his ordination gift. "Not at all," he'd replied, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit down." Ruby May had hesitated, clearly surprised by his courteous response. Most customers either demanded immediate service or dismissed her entirely if they weren't interested in her professional offerings. Samuel's invitation to simply sit and talk seemed to confuse her prepared approach. "Are you certain?" she'd asked, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to object to their conversation. "I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation by association." The comment had struck Samuel as remarkably considerate, coming from someone whose own reputation was already destroyed beyond repair. Her concern for his social standing suggested a moral sensitivity that contradicted everything his congregation had taught him about women in a profession. "I think my reputation can survive a conversation," Samuel had said with a slight smile. "Besides, I'm more interested in understanding people than in protecting myself from gossip." Ruby May had settled into the chair with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being watched and judged. Up close, Samuel had been able to see that her painted face couldn't entirely conceal the exhaustion that marked her features, and her hands showed the slight tremor that he'd learned to recognize as a sign of laudanum dependency during his pastoral training. "You're reading the Bible in a saloon," she'd observed, nodding toward the leather-bound volume on the table between them. "That's not something you see every day in establishments like this." "Perhaps it should be," Samuel had replied. "If the gospel is truly good news, it should be relevant in places where people need hope most desperately." The response had caused Ruby May to study his face with new intensity, as if she were trying to determine whether his words represented genuine belief or merely polite conversation. Samuel had found himself equally curious about her thoughts, wondering what experiences had shaped her understanding of religion and redemption. "Are you a preacher?" she'd asked finally. "I'm an assistant pastor at the First Presbyterian Church," Samuel had admitted, expecting her to excuse herself immediately once his identity was revealed. Instead, Ruby May had leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more earnest. "Then perhaps you can answer a question that's been troubling me. Do you believe that God's mercy extends to everyone, regardless of their circumstances or their past mistakes?" The question had hit Samuel like a physical blow, striking directly at the heart of his own spiritual crisis. Here was someone who genuinely needed to know about divine mercy, asking the very question that had been keeping him awake at night for weeks. "I believe," Samuel had said carefully, "that God's love is greater than human understanding, and that his mercy reaches places that respectable people prefer not to acknowledge." Ruby May's eyes had filled with tears at his response, though she'd maintained her composure with the practiced control of someone accustomed to hiding emotional vulnerability. "Even for women like me," she'd whispered, "women who've fallen so far that decent people won't even acknowledge their existence." The raw pain in her voice had shattered the last of Samuel's theoretical distance from the reality of human suffering. This wasn't an abstract theological discussion about predestination and salvation. This was a human soul crying out for hope in the face of absolute despair, especially for women like you, Samuel had said with a conviction that surprised him with its intensity. Christ spent his time with tax collectors and prostitutes, not because he approved of their choices, but because he understood their need for redemption. The conversation that had followed would change both their lives forever. Ruby May had told him about her descent from respectability to her current circumstances, speaking with brutal honesty about the choices she'd made and the forces that had trapped her in a life she'd never intended to live. Samuel had listened without judgment, offering neither condemnation nor false comfort, but simply bearing witness to her story with the kind of attention that treated her as a complete human being rather than a moral category. When she'd finally reached the end of her account, including her discovery of Montgomery's plan to sell her contract to a Denver brothel, Ruby May had looked directly into Samuel's eyes and made the proposal that would transform their destinies. "Reverend Thornbrook," she'd said, using his formal title with desperate respect, "I have a proposition that may shock you. But I'm asking you to consider it before you reject it outright. I need someone to marry me, not for love, not for romance, but as a business arrangement that would give me legal protection and a chance to become respectable again." Samuel had felt his breath catch as the implications of her request became clear. She was offering herself in marriage to a man she'd just met, gambling everything on the possibility that his Christian compassion extended beyond theological theory to practical action. "I have $43 saved," Ruby May had continued, her voice growing stronger as she'd committed to her desperate gamble. "I can cook, clean, and manage a household. I can read and write better than most women in this territory. I'll never embarrass you publicly or make demands on your affections. All I'm asking for is your name, your protection, and a chance to prove that redemption is possible for someone like me." The proposal had hung in the air between them, like a challenge to everything Samuel thought he understood about propriety, wisdom, and the practical limitations of Christian charity. Every instinct trained by seminary education and social convention had screamed at him to politely decline and extract himself from a situation that could destroy his ministry before it had truly begun. But as he'd looked into Ruby May's eyes, seeing the desperate hope warring with resigned expectation of rejection, Samuel had realized that this moment represented the ultimate test of whether his faith was genuine or merely social performance. "Ruby May," he'd said quietly, using her given name for the first time, "if I agreed to your proposal, it wouldn't be a business arrangement. It would be a covenant before God, with all the responsibilities and commitments that marriage entails." Her eyes had widened with surprise and something that might have been the first genuine hope she'd felt in 3 years. "Understand," she'd whispered, "and I would honor those commitments with everything I have." Samuel had closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer that was part plea for wisdom and part surrender to a divine will that seemed to be calling him toward the most difficult decision of his life. When he'd opened his eyes, Ruby May was watching him with an expression that combined desperate hope with resigned acceptance of whatever answer he might give. "Then I'll make you respectable," Samuel had said with quiet conviction. "Not because you need to be made respectable, but because society needs to learn that respectability isn't determined by past mistakes, but by present choices and future commitments." The response that had followed would echo through Deadwood Creek for generations, challenging everything the community believed about redemption, second chances, and the true meaning of Christian love. The silence that followed Samuel's declaration stretched across the smoky saloon like the held breath of eternity. Ruby May stared at him with an expression of such profound disbelief that for a moment Samuel wondered if she had truly heard his words, or if the combination of laudanum and desperation had caused her to misunderstand his response to her shocking proposal. "You would truly marry me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the piano's melancholy tune and the distant laughter of other patrons. "Even knowing what I am, what I've done?" Samuel felt the weight of the moment settling around them like a mantle of destiny. Every theological principle he'd been taught at Princeton Seminary seemed to be warring with the conviction growing in his heart that this broken woman represented not a test of his moral purity, but an opportunity to demonstrate the transformative power of divine grace in its most radical form. "Ruby May," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that what he said next would determine the trajectory of 2 lives. "What you've been forced to become is not who you are, and who you are is someone worthy of redemption, respect, and the protection that marriage would provide." The tears that had threatened throughout their conversation finally spilled over, creating clean tracks through the powder and rouge that masked her natural features. But even as she wept, Ruby May maintained the composed posture of someone who had learned never to display weakness in public, understanding that vulnerability could be weaponized by those who profited from others' desperation. "When?" she asked, wiping her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief that seemed incongruous with her surroundings. "Montgomery plans to ship me to Denver within the week. If we're going to do this, it has to be soon enough to legally prevent him from enforcing his contract." Samuel's stomach tightened as the practical implications of his decision began crystallizing into immediate challenges. Marrying a saloon girl would not only scandalize his congregation and potentially end his ministerial career, but it would also require navigating legal complexities he'd never considered during his seminary education. "Tomorrow morning," he said with more confidence than he felt. "I'll speak with Judge Harrison first thing and arrange for a marriage license. Then we'll need witnesses and someone to perform the ceremony." "Reverend McKinnon?" Ruby May asked, then immediately shook her head at her own suggestion. No, he would never agree to officiate such a wedding. Samuel had been thinking the same thing. His mentor's rigid interpretation of Christian doctrine would make him view a marriage between a minister and a prostitute as an abomination rather than an act of redemption. But there were other options in a frontier town where practical solutions often took precedence over theological niceties. "Judge Harrison can perform civil ceremonies," Samuel explained. "It won't be a church wedding, but it will be legally binding and morally legitimate." Ruby May nodded slowly, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional turmoil of the moment. "What about witnesses? You'll need respectable people willing to sign the marriage certificate, and I don't imagine your church friends will volunteer for that role." The challenge of finding witnesses who would support their union without destroying his ministerial prospects had already occurred to Samuel. But he'd identified potential solutions during his 3 weeks of pastoral visits throughout the community. "Dr. Benjamin Hartwell and his wife Catherine," Samuel said thoughtfully. "He's not a member of our congregation, but he's a respected physician who's mentioned his concerns about the spiritual welfare of women in your situation. His wife runs a charitable organization that helps families in crisis. The Hartwells would agree to witness our wedding?" Ruby May asked with surprise. "They're some of the most respected people in Deadwood Creek. Dr. Hartwell has spoken to me about the medical consequences of laudanum dependency," Samuel replied gently. "He understands that addiction is a disease rather than a moral failing, and he's expressed frustration that the community provides no legitimate options for women seeking to escape prostitution." Ruby May's hand instinctively moved to her reticule, where Samuel suspected she kept her supply of the opium-based medicine that made her circumstances bearable. The gesture revealed both her dependency and her shame about it, suggesting an awareness that marriage would require her to confront challenges beyond simply changing her social status. "Samuel," she said, using his given name for the first time, "there are things about my situation that you need to understand before you commit to this arrangement. The laudanum isn't just something I use occasionally. I need it to function, to get through each day without falling apart completely. And Montgomery's contract includes debts that might legally transfer to my husband." Her honesty about the complications their marriage would entail struck Samuel as remarkable, evidence of the integrity that survived beneath the damaged exterior she presented to the world. A truly manipulative woman would have concealed these problems until after the ceremony. But Ruby May was offering him complete information about the burdens he would be assuming. "How much do you owe Montgomery?" Samuel asked. "According to his accounting, $347, Ruby May replied bitterly, though his mathematics seemed designed to ensure that the debt grows faster than any woman could possibly pay it off. The sum represented more money than Samuel earned in 4 months. But it wasn't insurmountable for someone with his education and prospects. More troubling was the laudanum dependency, which he recognized as a medical condition that would require professional treatment rather than simple willpower to overcome. "Dr. Hartwell has experience treating opium addiction," Samuel said thoughtfully. "If you're willing to work with him, there are medical approaches that can help you reduce your dependency gradually and safely." Ruby May stared at him with an expression that combined hope and terror. "You would help me with that too? Even though it might take months, even though I might fail." "Ruby May, marriage is a covenant that includes in sickness and in health," Samuel replied. "If we do this, we do it completely, with all the challenges and responsibilities that commitment entails." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Silas Montgomery, who had been watching their extended discussion with growing suspicion from behind the bar. The saloon owner approached their table with the predatory confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every transaction within his establishment. "Ruby May," Montgomery said with false joviality, "you've been entertaining this gentleman for quite a while without any drinks being purchased. Perhaps it's time to encourage him to either pay for your company or allow you to attend to customers who appreciate your professional services." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest at the man's casual reduction of Ruby May to a commodity, but he maintained his composure, understanding that any confrontation at this moment could jeopardize their plans. "Actually, Mr. Montgomery," Ruby May said with surprising firmness, "I was just informing this gentleman that I won't be available for professional services much longer. I'll be leaving your employment tomorrow." Montgomery's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm as he processed the implications of her statement. Ruby May represented one of his most reliable sources of income, and her departure would significantly impact his profits, especially if other girls were encouraged to follow her example. "Leaving?" Montgomery repeated with dangerous softness. "I'm afraid that's not possible, my dear. You have outstanding debts that require you to remain in my employ until they're satisfied. And as I mentioned, I have arrangements pending that will transfer your contract to associates in Denver." "What if her debts were paid in full?" Samuel interjected quietly. "Would that dissolve her obligations to your establishment?" Montgomery studied Samuel with the calculating attention of a man assessing a potential threat to his business interests. "And who might you be, sir? And what interest do you have in my employees' financial arrangements?" "I'm Assistant Pastor Samuel Thornbrook of the First Presbyterian Church," Samuel replied evenly. "And Miss Callahan has accepted my proposal of marriage." The announcement hit Montgomery like a physical blow. His face cycled through expressions of shock, rage, and calculation as he processed the threat this development posed to his business model. If a respectable minister could successfully marry one of his girls, it might encourage others to seek similar escapes from their contracts. "Marriage," Montgomery sputtered. "Reverend, surely you're not serious. This woman is a whore, not suitable for any respectable man's wife." Ruby May flinched at the crude language, but Samuel's response was immediate and firm. "Mr. Montgomery, I'll thank you to speak respectfully about my fiancée. And yes, we intend to marry tomorrow morning." "This is ridiculous," Montgomery declared, his voice rising enough to attract attention from other patrons. "Ruby May, you can't seriously believe that any preacher would actually go through with marrying a saloon girl. This man is toying with you, probably trying to get free services by making promises he has no intention of keeping." The accusation struck at Ruby May's deepest fears about the situation. Samuel could see doubt creeping into her expression as Montgomery's words reinforced every reason she had to distrust men's promises and question whether someone of Samuel's social standing would actually risk his reputation for her benefit. "Samuel," Ruby May said quietly, "Mr. Montgomery raises valid concerns. You've known me for less than 2 hours. How can you be certain that you want to tie your life to someone with my history and problems?" The question forced Samuel to examine his own motivations with brutal honesty. Was he acting from genuine conviction about divine mercy, or was he simply indulging in romantic notions about rescuing fallen women? Had his theological crisis clouded his judgment about the practical realities of marrying someone whose life experiences were so different from his own? But as he looked into Ruby May's eyes, seeing the intelligence, dignity, and desperate hope that had survived 3 years of degradation and abuse, Samuel felt his uncertainty dissolving into clarity about what God was calling him to do. "Ruby May," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand in a gesture that shocked every observer in the saloon. "I'm certain because I've spent weeks praying for guidance about how to live out my faith authentically. And God has brought me to this moment, to you, to show me that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to see the perfect creation of God that exists within someone who's been wounded by an imperfect world." Montgomery snorted with derision. "Pretty words, preacher, but talk is cheap. If you're serious about this foolishness, then let's discuss the financial realities. Ruby May owes me $347 plus interest and penalty fees for early contract termination. Can you pay that debt tomorrow morning?" Samuel felt his heart sink as he calculated his available resources. His salary from the church provided adequate living expenses, but no substantial savings, and he'd spent most of his personal funds on books and furnishings for his new residence. He might be able to raise half the required amount, but not the full sum Montgomery was demanding. Ruby May seemed to sense his financial limitations and began withdrawing her hand from his, resignation replacing hope in her expression. "Samuel, I can't ask you to impoverish yourself for my freedom." Perhaps this was a foolish dream after all, but Samuel tightened his grip on her hand, his mind racing through possibilities he'd never considered before this moment. "Mr. Montgomery, what if we structured a payment plan? I could pay half the debt immediately and the remainder over 6 months. "Cash only," Montgomery replied smugly. "These debts have been accumulating interest for 3 years. I'm not extending credit to a preacher who's probably making $30 a month." The negotiation seemed to be reaching an impasse when an unexpected voice interrupted. From behind Samuel's shoulder, "Perhaps I could be of assistance with this situation." Samuel turned to see Dr. Benjamin Hartwell standing beside their table, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other. The physician's presence in the silver dollar was surprising enough, but his apparent willingness to involve himself in their conversation was even more remarkable. "Dr. Hartwell," Samuel said, rising respectfully. "I didn't realize you were here this evening." "Professional call," Dr. Hartwell explained briefly. "One of the girls upstairs took ill, and Mr. Montgomery sent for medical assistance. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I believe I might have a solution to propose." Montgomery's expression grew wary as he faced the community's most respected physician. Dr. Hartwell's opinion carried significant weight in Deadwood, Greek, and his involvement could complicate Montgomery's efforts to retain control over Ruby May's contract. "Dr. Hartwell," Montgomery said with forced politeness, "this is a private business matter between myself and my employee. Actually, Mr. Montgomery, it's become a matter of community interest," Dr. Hartwell replied calmly. "Reverend Thornbrook, Miss Callahan, would you be willing to discuss this situation in a more private setting? I believe there are medical and legal aspects to this arrangement that should be addressed before any final decisions are made." Ruby May looked uncertainly between the two men who were offering to involve themselves in her desperate situation. "Dr. Hartwell, I appreciate your concern, but I couldn't ask you to compromise your reputation by association with my circumstances." "Miss Callahan," Dr. Hartwell said kindly, "my reputation is based on helping people who need medical care, regardless of their social circumstances. And I believe your situation requires both medical and legal intervention to ensure a successful outcome." The physician's unexpected support provided exactly the kind of respectable backing that Samuel had hoped to secure for their marriage. With Dr. Hartwell's involvement, their union would have the endorsement of someone whose moral authority in the community rivaled that of any clergyman. "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, Samuel said with renewed confidence. "Judge Harrison's office for the marriage license. Then a civil ceremony with Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell as witnesses." Ruby May nodded slowly, her expression reflecting a mixture of terror and anticipation that seemed appropriate for someone whose entire life was about to be transformed in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Montgomery opened his mouth to protest, but Dr. Hartwell's steady gaze silenced him before he could speak. The saloon owner's business depended on maintaining at least minimal community tolerance, and antagonizing the town's leading physician over one girl's contract could have consequences far beyond the immediate financial loss. As the three of them prepared to leave the Silver Dollar together, Ruby May turned back to Montgomery with a dignity that surprised everyone present. "Mr. Montgomery," she said clearly, "I'll be sending someone to collect my personal belongings tomorrow afternoon. And I want you to know that I harbor no ill will toward you. You provided me with shelter and income when I had no other options, and I'm grateful for that, even though our arrangement was never meant to be permanent." Her gracious farewell to the man who had exploited her, dependency and addiction, struck Samuel as remarkable evidence of the character that had survived intact despite 3 years of degradation. This was the woman he was choosing to marry, someone capable of gratitude without bitterness, dignity without pride, and hope without naivety about the challenges ahead. As they stepped out into the cool Colorado evening, Samuel realized that the easy part of their arrangement was now behind them. Tomorrow would bring the legal ceremony that would make Ruby May his wife. But the real work of transformation, for both of them, would require months or years of commitment to building a marriage based on mutual respect, shared faith, and the daily choice to believe in each other's capacity for growth and redemption. The woman walking beside him toward an uncertain future was no longer just Ruby May, the saloon girl desperate for escape. She was becoming Margaret Ruby Thornbrook, a minister's wife who would either prove that redemption was possible for anyone or demonstrate the limits of love's power to overcome the consequences of past choices. Either way, Samuel thought as they approached Dr. Hartwell's carriage, tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most challenging and potentially rewarding ministry of his life. Dawn broke over Deadwood Creek on October 19, 1887. With the crisp clarity that only Colorado autumn mornings could provide. Ruby May stood at the window of Dr. Hartwell's guest room, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber, while her fingers trembled against the simple cotton dress that Catherine Hartwell had provided for the ceremony. The garment was modest by any standard, high neckline, long sleeves, and a skirt that revealed nothing more scandalous than the tips of borrowed boots. But to a woman who had spent 3 years in silk and satin designed to entice rather than respect, it felt like armor against a world that had forgotten she possessed any dignity worth protecting. The events of the previous evening still seemed surreal in the morning light. After leaving the Silver Dollar with Samuel and Dr. Hartwell, she'd been transported not to some anonymous boarding house or temporary shelter, but to the Hartwell family's own home, where Catherine Hartwell had welcomed her with the kind of maternal warmth that Ruby May had forgotten existed in respectable society. "My dear," Mrs. Hartwell had said simply, opening the front door before her husband could complete the introductions. "Benjamin told me about your situation when he sent word ahead. You're safe here, and tomorrow we'll help you begin a new chapter of your life." The physician's wife was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see past surface appearances to the essential humanity beneath. She had guided Ruby May to a comfortable guest room, provided clean nightclothes and toiletries, and offered a light supper without asking intrusive questions about her background or circumstances. Most remarkably, Mrs. Hartwell had treated her as a guest rather than a charity case, discussing practical matters like the morning ceremony, with the same matter-of-fact kindness she might have shown any young woman preparing for marriage. The absence of judgment or condescension had been so unexpected that Ruby May had found herself weeping quietly into her pillow, not from despair, but from the overwhelming relief of being treated as a human being worthy of basic respect. The night had been largely sleepless, not from laudanum withdrawal as she had feared, but from the mental adjustment required to process the magnitude of change that awaited her. In less than 4 hours, she would legally become Mrs. Samuel Thornbrook, transforming from a social outcast into a minister's wife with all the responsibilities and expectations that such a position entailed. The weight of that transformation pressed against her consciousness like a physical burden. She had been Ruby May for 3 years, learning to navigate a world where survival depended on reading men's desires and managing their expectations with careful calculation. Now she would need to become Margaret again, reclaiming skills and sensibilities that she had deliberately suppressed in order to function in her former profession. More challenging still was the question of whether Samuel truly understood what he was undertaking. His theological convictions about redemption and divine mercy were admirable, but marriage required more than noble intentions. Could a man raised in comfort and respectability truly build a life with someone whose experiences included realities he could barely imagine? Would his love survive the daily reminders of her past, the social consequences of their union, and the practical challenges of helping her overcome her dependency on laudanum? A soft knock at the guest room door interrupted her anxious reflections. Mrs. Hartwell entered carrying a breakfast tray and wearing an expression of gentle concern. "You haven't eaten much since yesterday evening," Catherine observed, setting the tray on the small table beside the window. "Wedding day nerves are perfectly natural, but you'll need strength for what lies ahead." Ruby May accepted the offered cup of coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that reminded her of better times in her childhood home. "Mrs. Hartwell, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, dear. Do you think your husband and Reverend Thornbrook are making a mistake? Supporting this marriage, I mean. Wouldn't it be wiser for Samuel to find a respectable woman who could advance his ministry rather than burden it with scandal?" Catherine Hartwell settled into the room's second chair and studied Ruby May's face with the careful attention of someone forming a considered opinion. "Margaret, may I call you Margaret? I've been married to Benjamin for 28 years, and I've learned that wisdom in marriage isn't about avoiding difficulties, but about choosing the right person to face difficulties alongside." She paused to sip her own coffee before continuing. "Yesterday evening, Benjamin and I spent considerable time discussing your situation with Reverend Thornbrook. What impressed us wasn't his romantic notions about rescuing fallen women, but his clear-eyed understanding of the challenges ahead and his commitment to supporting you through them. But surely you must have concerns about the scandal this will cause. Dr. Hartwell's reputation. My husband's reputation is built on 30 years of treating anyone who needed medical care, regardless of their ability to pay or their social standing," Catherine interrupted gently. "If anything, supporting your marriage enhances that reputation by demonstrating his commitment to healing broken lives as well as broken bodies." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hartwell himself, who knocked briefly before entering with a small medical bag and an expression of professional concern. "Margaret, I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I wanted to examine you before the ceremony to ensure you're physically prepared for the day ahead. Yesterday you mentioned some dependency on laudanum, and I'd like to assess your current condition." Ruby May submitted to the examination with the resigned cooperation of someone accustomed to medical intrusions, though Dr. Hartwell's approach was markedly different from the rough handling she had experienced from physicians who treated saloon girls as damaged goods rather than patients. "Deserving professional care. Your pulse is elevated, which is consistent with both wedding nerves and mild opiate withdrawal," Dr. Hartwell reported after completing his assessment. "When did you last take laudanum?" 2 days ago, Ruby May admitted. "I wanted to be clear-headed for today, regardless of the discomfort." "That shows remarkable strength of will," the physician replied approvingly. "The physical dependency can be managed with gradual reduction rather than complete cessation. I'll prepare a schedule that reduces your daily dose by small increments. Over several months, the medical consultation concluded with Dr. Hartwell providing Ruby May with a small bottle of mild sedative to help manage her wedding day anxiety, along with specific instructions about timing and dosage. that reflected his understanding of her condition without judgment about how she had acquired it. At 8:30, Samuel arrived at the Hartwell home, wearing his best black suit and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers that he had apparently gathered during his morning walk. His appearance was that of a man who had slept little but remained committed to his decision, and Ruby May found herself studying his face for any signs of doubt or regret. "Good morning, Margaret," he said formally, offering her the flowers with a slight bow that seemed to acknowledge the significance of the occasion. "Are you ready to become Mrs. Thornbrook?" "As ready as anyone can be for such a momentous change," she replied, accepting the bouquet with hands that trembled only slightly. "Samuel, are you certain about this? Once we speak our vows, there will be no returning to your former life." Samuel's response was immediate and decisive. "My former life was comfortable but incomplete. God has called me to this moment, to you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve him through our marriage." The short carriage ride to Judge Harrison's office provided a final opportunity for private conversation before they would become husband and wife before witnesses and the law. Samuel used the time to outline practical arrangements he had made for their immediate future. "I've rented a small house on Elm Street," he explained. "It's modest but respectable, with a garden where you could grow vegetables if you're inclined toward domestic pursuits. The church provides my salary, but I've also arranged to offer private tutoring in Latin and theology to supplement our income." "You've planned for everything," Ruby May observed with wonder. "Most men would need weeks to arrange such details." "I've had 3 weeks to think about what kind of life I wanted to build in Deadwood Creek," Samuel replied. "Yesterday evening simply clarified who I wanted to build it with." Judge Harrison's office occupied the second floor of the territorial courthouse, a substantial brick building that represented the federal government's commitment to bringing law and order to Colorado's mining territories. The judge himself was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the weathered features of someone who had spent decades mediating disputes between miners, ranchers, and merchants in communities where legal precedent often mattered less than practical solutions. "Reverend Thornbrook," Judge Harrison greeted them as they entered his chambers. "Dr. Hartwell explained your situation when he stopped by earlier this morning. I understand you wish to be married as quickly as possible." "Yes, Your Honor," Samuel replied. "Miss Callahan and I would like to exchange vows this morning, with Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell serving as witnesses." Judge Harrison studied Ruby May with the careful attention of someone accustomed to assessing character under difficult circumstances. "Miss Callahan, this is your free choice. No one is compelling you to enter into this marriage." "It's entirely my choice, Your Honor," Ruby May replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "Reverend Thornbrook has offered me an opportunity for a new life, and I'm grateful to accept it." The judge nodded approvingly and retrieved the necessary paperwork from his desk. "Then let's proceed with the ceremony. Marriage is a serious undertaking, but it's also one of the most hopeful acts 2 people can perform together." The civil ceremony was brief but solemn, conducted with the same gravity that Judge Harrison brought to all legal proceedings. Samuel and Ruby May exchanged vows that promised mutual respect, support, and commitment to building a life together based on shared values rather than romantic passion. Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell served as witnesses, signing the marriage certificate with expressions of genuine pleasure at the union they were helping to solemnize. When Judge Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Ruby May's cheek with gentle respect rather than passionate enthusiasm, a gesture that acknowledged the tentative nature of their emotional connection while confirming their legal and moral commitment to each other. "Mrs. Thornbrook," Samuel said quietly as they emerged from the courthouse into the bright October sunshine, "how does it feel to be a respectable married woman?" Ruby May considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotional state as she adjusted to her new identity. "Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure," she admitted. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's clothes, but clothes that might actually fit if I grow into them properly. The newlyweds' first public appearance as husband and wife occurred during their walk from the courthouse to their new home on Elm Street. Word of their marriage had somehow preceded them through the community's efficient gossip network, and curious observers lined the sidewalks to witness the spectacle of a Presbyterian minister escorting a former saloon girl through the respectable neighborhoods of Deadwood Creek. The reactions varied significantly among different segments of the community. Working-class families seemed largely supportive, nodding respectfully and offering congratulations that suggested approval for Samuel's willingness to offer redemption to someone who needed it. Merchants and professionals displayed more caution, acknowledging the couple politely but maintaining careful distance that protected their own reputations from association with scandal. The most hostile responses came from the wives of prominent community leaders, women who viewed Ruby May's transformation as a threat to the social order that defined their own status and respectability. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, the church organist, actually crossed the street to avoid acknowledging their presence, while Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, the mayor's wife, stared at them with unconcealed disapproval that bordered on disgust. "This is going to be more difficult than I anticipated," Ruby May murmured as they approached their new home, a modest two-story structure with white clapboard siding and a small front porch that overlooked a garden plot ready for spring planting. "Difficult. Yes," Samuel agreed, opening the front gate with one hand while maintaining his supportive grip on her arm with the other. "But not impossible. We have allies and we have each other, and most importantly, we have the conviction that what we're doing is right." The interior of their new home was sparsely but adequately furnished, with items that Samuel had purchased during his first weeks in Deadwood Creek: a sitting room with comfortable chairs and a small bookshelf, a kitchen equipped for basic cooking, and upstairs bedrooms that would allow them to maintain separate sleeping arrangements until their relationship developed beyond mere legal convenience. "Samuel," Ruby May said as they stood together in the front hallway of what was now their shared home, "I want you to know that I understand the difference between a marriage of convenience and a marriage of love. I don't expect romantic affection from you, but I promise to be the best wife I can become." Samuel's response revealed the depth of thought he had given to the emotional dimensions of their arrangement. "Margaret, I believe that love grows from respect, shared experiences, and mutual commitment to each other's welfare. We may not have passionate romance today, but we have the foundation for something deeper and more lasting if we're both willing to build it together." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at their front door, the first of what would prove to be many visitors during their initial days as a married couple. Mrs. Catherine Hartwell stood on their porch carrying a basket that smelled deliciously of fresh bread and roasted chicken. "Wedding dinner," she announced cheerfully, entering their home with the confidence of someone who had appointed herself as their guardian and advocate. "Benjamin and I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal on your first day as husband and wife." As the three of them shared their impromptu wedding feast around the small kitchen table, Ruby May found herself experiencing something she hadn't felt in 3 years: the simple pleasure of being welcomed into someone's family circle without having to perform or pretend or calculate the cost of acceptance. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she was Margaret Ruby Thornbrook, a married woman with a home, a husband, and allies who were willing to help her build a respectable life. The transformation was complete legally and socially, but the real work of becoming worthy of her new identity had only just begun. As evening approached and the Hartwells prepared to return to their own home, Samuel and Ruby May, now Margaret, stood together on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the Colorado mountains and contemplating the future they had chosen to build together. "Tomorrow," Samuel said quietly, "we begin the real work of making this marriage into something meaningful and lasting." Margaret nodded. understanding that today's ceremony had been the easy part. The challenge ahead would be proving to themselves, their community, and their God that redemption was not just a theological concept, but a practical reality that could transform broken lives into something beautiful and useful. The saloon girl who had begged for escape was gone forever, replaced by a minister's wife who would either demonstrate the power of divine grace or reveal the limits of human transformation. Either way, she would face that future as Mrs. Samuel Thornbrook, with all the responsibilities and possibilities that such an identity entailed. The morning of October 22nd marked Margaret Thornbrook's first Sunday as a minister's wife, and she stood before her bedroom mirror with hands that trembled as she attempted to arrange her hair in the conservative style appropriate for someone of her new station. 3 days of marriage had not yet erased the habits of a woman who had spent years perfecting appearances designed to attract male attention, and every instinct screamed against the modest clothing and understated presentation that respectability demanded. Samuel had risen early for his morning prayers and sermon preparation, leaving Margaret alone with her anxiety about facing the congregation that would judge whether his unprecedented marriage represented divine inspiration or catastrophic error in judgment. Through the thin walls of their modest home, she could hear him rehearsing passages from his sermon, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had wrestled with Scripture, until it yielded practical wisdom for contemporary challenges. The past 3 days had established patterns that would define their domestic life for months to come. Samuel treated Margaret with unfailing courtesy and respect, but maintained the emotional distance of someone still adjusting to sharing his living space with a virtual stranger. They took meals together, discussed practical household matters, and shared evening prayers, but their conversations remained carefully neutral, avoiding topics that might reveal too much about their inner thoughts or feelings. Margaret had thrown herself into domestic tasks with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove her worthiness for redemption. She had cleaned their modest home until every surface gleamed, planned meals with careful attention to both nutrition and economy, and studied Samuel's theological books during his absence, hoping to educate herself about the intellectual foundations of his faith. The laudanum withdrawal had proven less physically debilitating than she had feared, thanks to Dr. Hartwell's gradual reduction schedule, but the emotional aspects of recovery created challenges she hadn't anticipated. Without the numbing protection of opium, she found herself experiencing feelings with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed her capacity to function normally. Guilt about her past choices, anxiety about her future prospects, and a complex mixture of gratitude and resentment toward Samuel's rescue created an emotional storm that required constant effort to manage. Most difficult was learning to navigate the social expectations that governed ministers, wives in frontier communities. Margaret had observed these women from a distance during her time at the Silver Dollar, noting their conservative dress, restrained behavior, and careful attention to moral proprieties. Now she was expected to embody these same standards while knowing that every gesture would be scrutinized for evidence that her reformation was genuine rather than merely convenient. The knock at their front door at 8 o'clock Sunday morning announced the arrival of their first real test as a married couple. Samuel answered to find Reverend Augustus McKinnon standing on their porch, his stern expression suggesting that this was not a social call, but an official inquiry into circumstances that threatened the church's reputation. "Samuel," the elderly pastor said without preamble, "we need to discuss your marriage and its implications for your continued service to this congregation." Margaret heard the conversation from the kitchen where she had been preparing breakfast, and her stomach clenched with the familiar fear of abandonment that had haunted her since her parents' deaths. She had known this confrontation was inevitable, but the reality of facing potential rejection from the church community that provided Samuel's livelihood created anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "Of course, Reverend McKinnon," Samuel replied evenly. "Please come in. Margaret, would you join us in the sitting room?" The formal introduction that followed revealed the magnitude of the challenge they faced. Reverend McKinnon examined Margaret with the cold assessment of someone evaluating a potential threat to everything he had spent decades building. His disapproval was palpable, though he maintained the surface civility that his position demanded. "Mrs. Thornbrook," McKinnon said, using her married name with obvious reluctance, "I understand that your background differs significantly from what this congregation expects in a minister's wife." "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor of fear that threatened to betray her composure. "I'm aware that my past creates difficulties for both Samuel and the church." "Difficulties?" McKinnon's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise at her understatement. "Mrs. Thornbrook, your marriage to my assistant pastor has created a scandal that threatens to destroy this church's moral authority in the community. Half the congregation is demanding Samuel's immediate dismissal, while the other half is waiting to see whether this arrangement represents genuine redemption or mere wishful thinking." Samuel's response was immediate and firm. "Reverend McKinnon, my marriage is based on biblical principles of forgiveness and restoration. If the congregation cannot accept those principles when they're applied practically, then perhaps we need to examine whether our faith is genuine or merely social performance." The challenge implicit in Samuel's words created a tense silence that filled the small sitting room like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Margaret realized that she was witnessing a confrontation between two different interpretations of Christian doctrine, with her own future hanging in the balance of their theological disagreement. "Samuel," McKinnon said slowly, "I admire your compassion, but wisdom requires us to consider the practical consequences of our actions. This congregation provides financial support based on their confidence in our moral leadership. If they lose that confidence, both of our positions become untenable. Then let's give them reason to maintain their confidence," Margaret interjected, surprising both men with her intervention. "Reverend McKinnon, what specific concerns do the congregation members have about my fitness to serve as a minister's wife?" McKinnon studied her with renewed attention, apparently reassessing his initial assumptions about her intelligence and character. "They question whether someone with your background can genuinely embrace the moral standards that such a position requires. They wonder whether your conversion is authentic or expedient." "Those are fair questions," Margaret admitted. "I would have the same concerns if I were in their position. May I suggest a trial period during which I can demonstrate my commitment to living according to Christian principles?" The proposal created another moment of tense silence as McKinnon processed the implications of her offer. Margaret had essentially volunteered to submit herself to congregational scrutiny, gambling that her performance as a minister's wife would eventually overcome their prejudices about her past. "What kind of trial period?" McKinnon asked cautiously. 6 months, Margaret replied without hesitation, "during which I will participate fully in church activities, submit to whatever oversight the congregation deems appropriate, and prove through my actions that my reformation is genuine. If at the end of 6 months the congregation remains unconvinced, Samuel and I will relocate to another community where our ministry can be more effective." Samuel looked at his wife with surprise and something that might have been admiration. Her willingness to subject herself to extended scrutiny demonstrated both courage and confidence in her ability to meet the challenge, qualities that suggested deeper strength than her desperate circumstances had initially revealed. "That seems like a reasonable proposal," Samuel said, clearly supporting Margaret's initiative. "Reverend McKinnon, would the church board accept such an arrangement?" McKinnon's expression remained skeptical, but Margaret could see him calculating the political advantages of her offer. A 6-month trial would allow the congregation to observe her behavior while providing church leadership with an eventual exit. Strategy if the experiment failed. I'll present your proposal to the board, McKinnon said finally. But I must warn you both that the scrutiny will be intense and the standards will be higher than those applied to conventional ministers' wives. I understand, Margaret replied, and I welcome the opportunity to prove myself worthy of the confidence you're considering placing in me. After McKinnon's departure, Samuel and Margaret sat together in their sitting room, processing the magnitude of the commitment she had just made on their behalf. 6 months, Samuel said thoughtfully. That's a significant gamble, Margaret. Are you certain you're prepared for that level of examination and judgment? Samuel, I've been judged by every person I've encountered for the past 3 years, Margaret replied with quiet conviction. The difference is that now I have the opportunity to influence those judgments through my actions, rather than simply enduring them because of my circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by another knock at their door, this time announcing the arrival of Catherine Hartwell with a basket of fresh-baked goods and an expression of warm determination. I heard about Reverend McKinnon's visit, she said without preamble. The gossip network in this town is more efficient than the telegraph system. I wanted you to know that Benjamin and I support your trial period proposal completely, Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret said gratefully. Your support means more than you know, but I don't want to create difficulties for your family because of your association with mine. Margaret. Dear, Catherine replied with gentle firmness, Benjamin and I have been members of this community for 25 years. Our reputation is strong enough to withstand association with people we believe deserve support. Besides, if the congregation can't accept genuine repentance and reformation, then they need to examine their own understanding of Christian doctrine. The Hartwell support provided crucial encouragement, but Margaret understood that the real test would come during the morning worship service, when she would make her first appearance before the full congregation. As Samuel's wife, the walk to First Presbyterian Church required only 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey across a vast divide between her old life and her new identity. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Catherine Hartwell had helped her select, with her hair arranged in a conservative style that suggested respectability without vanity. Samuel walked beside her with quiet dignity, acknowledging greetings from community members with the same courtesy he had always displayed. The church building itself was a modest structure of white clapboard with a tall steeple that dominated Deadwood Creek's skyline. Inside, wooden pews arranged in neat rows faced a simple pulpit where Samuel would deliver his sermon to a congregation that included many people who had never spoken to Margaret directly, but had formed strong opinions about her character and fitness for her new role. Their entrance created an immediate stir of whispered conversations and meaningful glances as congregation. Members assessed Margaret's appearance and demeanor. She walked with Samuel to the front pew, traditionally reserved for clergy families, acutely aware that every gesture was being evaluated for evidence of either genuine transformation or continued moral deficiency. The service began with hymns that Margaret knew from her childhood, and she found unexpected comfort in joining her voice with others in praising God, who had brought her through circumstances she had never expected to survive. When Samuel rose to deliver his sermon, Margaret offered a silent prayer that his words would help the congregation understand the theological foundation for their marriage. Samuel's sermon, drawn from the parable of the lost sheep, emphasized God's active pursuit of those who had wandered from righteousness and his joy in their restoration to the fold. His delivery was passionate and personal, clearly informed by his own recent experiences with extending practical mercy rather than theoretical forgiveness. Christ did not wait for the lost sheep to find its own way home. Samuel declared from the pulpit, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. He left the 99 who were safe and sought the one who was in danger. And when he found that lost sheep, he did not lecture it about the foolishness of wandering away. He carried it home on his shoulders, rejoicing in its rescue. The sermon's application to Margaret's situation was unmistakable, and she could feel the congregation's reaction like a physical force. Some faces showed thoughtful consideration of Samuel's argument, while others displayed skepticism about whether biblical metaphors applied to contemporary social situations. After the service concluded, Margaret faced her first real test of social acceptance as congregation members decided whether to acknowledge her presence or maintain the social distance that would signal their disapproval of Samuel's choice. The results were mixed, but more encouraging than she had dared to hope. Several families approached to offer cautious welcomes, led by Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell, whose public support encouraged others to extend similar courtesies. The working-class members of the congregation seemed generally supportive, perhaps understanding from their own experiences that respectability was often a matter of opportunity rather than inherent virtue. The most hostile reactions came from the wives of prominent community leaders, women who viewed Margaret's presence as a threat to the social hierarchies that defined their own status. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, the church organist, made a point of avoiding eye contact entirely, while Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, the mayor's wife, offered a greeting so cold it bordered on insult, but the overall response suggested that Margaret's trial period might provide a genuine opportunity for acceptance, rather than merely 6 months of extended humiliation. Before inevitable rejection, as they walked home after the service, Samuel reflected on the morning's events with cautious optimism. "That went better than I expected," he admitted. "Your proposal for a trial period was inspired, Margaret. It gives us time to prove ourselves while allowing the congregation to adjust gradually to our situation." "The real work begins now," Margaret replied. "Sunday morning courtesy is different from daily acceptance. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to prove myself worthy of the faith you've placed in me." That afternoon brought their first visitor since the church service, a tentative knock at their door that announced the arrival of Mrs. Sarah Collins, a young mother whose husband worked in the mines and whose own struggles with poverty had taught her sympathy for others facing difficult circumstances. "Mrs. Thornbrook," she said shyly, "I wanted to welcome you to our congregation and ask if you might be willing to help with the church's charitable work. We provide meals and clothing for families in crisis, and we could use someone with organizational skills." The invitation represented Margaret's first opportunity to contribute actively to the church community, rather than simply defending her right to belong to it. Her acceptance marked the beginning of practical ministry that would either demonstrate her genuine commitment to Christian service or reveal the limitations of her transformation. As evening approached, and the first Sunday of her trial period drew to a close, Margaret sat with Samuel on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the Colorado mountains and reflecting on the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. 6 months, Samuel said quietly. "At the end of that time, we'll know whether this experiment in practical redemption has succeeded or whether we need to find a different community where our ministry can be more effective." Margaret nodded, understanding that their marriage had become more than a personal arrangement between two people seeking companionship and security. It had become a test case for whether Christian principles of forgiveness and restoration could overcome social prejudices and transform not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of who deserved mercy and second chances. The saloon girl who had begged for escape was truly gone now, replaced by a minister's wife who would spend the next 6 months proving that redemption was not just a theological concept, but a practical reality that could change lives, marriages, and communities willing to embrace its transformative power. 2 weeks into Margaret's trial period, she found herself standing in the basement of First Presbyterian Church at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, surrounded by sacks of flour, crates of preserved vegetables, and bolts of donated fabric that comprised the church's charitable supply depot. Mrs. Sarah Collins worked beside her, sorting donations while sharing the kind of intimate conversation that develops between women who have discovered mutual respect despite vastly different backgrounds. The Morrison family donated 3 barrels of salt pork last month, Sarah explained as they inventoried the preserved meats. But they made it clear that the donation was contingent on their approval of how it would be distributed. Mrs. Victoria Morrison specifically requested that we not provide assistance to families she considers morally questionable. Margaret paused in her counting to consider the implications of charity with conditions attached. During her time at the Silver Dollar, she had observed the complex social hierarchies that governed Deadwood Creek, but her new position provided insight into how those hierarchies affected the community's most vulnerable members. What constitutes morally questionable in Mrs. Morrison's judgment? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Families where the father drinks excessively, women who work outside their homes by necessity rather than choice, and anyone whose circumstances suggest what she calls poor decision-making. Sarah replied with obvious frustration. Essentially, anyone whose poverty might reflect badly on the community's moral standards. The conversation revealed challenges that Margaret hadn't anticipated when she'd volunteered to help with charitable work. She had assumed that Christian service would provide opportunities to demonstrate her reformed character while contributing meaningfully to community welfare. Instead, she was discovering that even charity was subject to the same social prejudices that had initially made her marriage controversial. Over the past 2 weeks, Margaret had thrown herself into church activities with the determination of someone who understood that her trial period required not just avoiding scandal, but actively proving her worthiness for acceptance. She had organized the charitable supply depot with efficiency that impressed even skeptical congregation members, established visiting schedules for sick parishioners, and created detailed records of family needs that allowed the church to provide assistance more effectively than ever before. Her administrative skills, honed during her childhood education and refined through necessity during her years at the Silver Dollar, had proven invaluable for managing the complex logistics of charitable work. More importantly, her personal experience with desperation and social rejection had given her insights into the needs of struggling families that more privileged church members often missed entirely. Mrs. Thornbrook, Sarah continued using Margaret's married name with the casual familiarity that had developed between them. I hope you don't mind my asking, but how do you maintain such patience with people who question your right to be here? Some of the things I've heard said about you would have sent me into fits of rage. Margaret considered the question while folding donated children's clothing that would be distributed to families whose mining wages couldn't stretch to cover growing children's needs. The patience Sarah had observed wasn't natural virtue, but hard-won wisdom about the futility of responding to prejudice with anger. During my previous circumstances, Margaret replied carefully, I learned that other people's opinions about my character said more about them than about me. Getting angry at prejudice only confirms what prejudice people want to believe about you. The answer seemed to satisfy Sarah's curiosity while avoiding details about Margaret's past that might compromise the careful respectability she was building. Their friendship had developed naturally around shared work and mutual respect. But Margaret remained cautious about revealing too much about her experiences at the Silver Dollar. Their morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Elizabeth Crenshaw, a widow in her 70s whose husband had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier, leaving her with no income and 3 young grandchildren to support. Mrs. Crenshaw's pride made her reluctant to ask for assistance directly, but her increasingly desperate circumstances had finally forced her to swallow her dignity and approach the church for help. Mrs. Thornbrook, Mrs. Collins, the elderly woman said, with the careful formality of someone who had been respectable too long to feel comfortable accepting charity. "I was wondering if the church might have any work available that would allow me to earn a few dollars for winter supplies." Margaret recognized the diplomatic phrasing that allowed Mrs. Crenshaw to maintain her dignity while acknowledging her need for assistance. The woman wasn't asking for charity, but for the opportunity to work for the help she desperately needed. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Margaret replied with equal formality, "we've been looking for someone with experience managing household supplies to help us reorganize our charitable depot. The work would involve cataloging donations, maintaining inventory records, and coordinating distribution schedules. Would you be interested in discussing such a position?" The relief that flooded Mrs. Crenshaw's weathered features revealed how desperate her situation had become. Margaret had essentially created a paid position that would allow the widow to support her family while preserving her sense of independence and usefulness. "I would be very interested in such work," Mrs. Crenshaw replied with genuine gratitude. "I managed my husband's store for 20 years before his accident, so I have experience with inventory and record keeping." After arranging the details of Mrs. Crenshaw's employment, Margaret found herself walking home through the crisp October morning with a sense of satisfaction that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to remember. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she was contributing to something larger than her own survival. Using her skills and experience to improve other people's circumstances, the feeling was interrupted by an encounter that reminded her how precarious her position in the community remained. Mrs. Victoria Morrison emerged from Pemberton's general store just as Margaret was passing, creating an unavoidable social collision that would test the boundaries of acceptable behavior between women of vastly different social standings. "Mrs. Thornbrook," Victoria said with the kind of cold politeness that was more insulting than open hostility, "I understand you've been quite busy with the church's charitable work." "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied respectfully, understanding that this conversation was a test of her ability to navigate social confrontation without providing ammunition for her critics. "I hope you understand that such work requires absolute discretion about the families we assist," Victoria continued, her tone suggesting that she doubted Margaret's ability to maintain appropriate confidentiality. The wrong kind of publicity could damage both the church's reputation and the dignity of those who receive assistance. The warning was clear. Victoria Morrison was watching for any evidence that Margaret's involvement in charitable work was motivated by self-promotion rather than genuine service. More troubling, it suggested that influential community members were actively looking for reasons to end Margaret's trial period prematurely. "I understand completely, Mrs. Morrison," Margaret replied with careful respect. "The families we serve deserve privacy and dignity, regardless of their circumstances." "Indeed," Victoria said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm sure you appreciate how important reputation is, especially for those of us who have worked hard to maintain community standards." The implied threat was unmistakable. Margaret's reformed status depended on the continued tolerance of people like Victoria Morrison, and that tolerance could be withdrawn at any time if Margaret failed to meet their expectations of proper behavior. As Margaret continued her walk home, she reflected on the complex social dynamics that governed her new life. Her marriage to Samuel had provided legal protection and social respectability, but it hadn't eliminated the power that established families held over community acceptance. She remained vulnerable to the whims of people who viewed her reformation as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent transformation. The afternoon brought a visit from Dr. Hartwell, who stopped by for one of his regular medical consultations regarding Margaret's continuing recovery from laudanum dependency. These sessions had become important sources of both medical support and personal encouragement, providing Margaret with professional guidance about managing the physical aspects of her recovery. "Your progress continues to be remarkable," Dr. Hartwell reported after completing his examination. "The reduction schedule is working well, and your physical health is improving significantly. How are you managing the emotional aspects of recovery?" "Some days are better than others," Margaret admitted honestly. "Without the laudanum, I feel everything more intensely, both good and bad experiences. It's overwhelming sometimes, but also liberating in ways I hadn't expected." Dr. Hartwell nodded with understanding. "That's entirely normal. Your emotional responses are returning to natural levels after years of artificial suppression. The intensity will moderate as your system continues adjusting." Their conversation moved beyond medical matters to discuss Margaret's integration into the church community and the challenges she was facing during her trial. "I've heard about your work with the charitable depot," Dr. Hartwell said approvingly. "Sarah Collins tells me you've increased the efficiency of their operations significantly while creating employment for Mrs. Crenshaw. I'm trying to demonstrate that my reformation involves active contribution to the community rather than simply avoiding scandal," Margaret explained. "But I'm learning that some people prefer to see charity as confirmation of their own virtue rather than as practical assistance for those who need help." "That's an astute observation," Dr. Hartwell replied. "You've identified one of the fundamental tensions in religious communities, the difference between charity as spiritual exercise and charity as practical service to others." The physician's intellectual approach to social problems had become one of Margaret's sources of guidance as she navigated the complex expectations of her new role. Unlike many community members who viewed her situation in purely moral terms, Dr. Hartwell treated her challenges as practical problems, requiring thoughtful solutions rather than theological judgments. "Dr. Hartwell," Margaret said carefully, "may I ask your honest assessment of my prospects for acceptance by the congregation? I know you hear community opinions that aren't shared directly with Samuel or me." Dr. Hartwell considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to medical diagnoses. "The community is divided, but the division isn't along the lines you might expect. Your strongest supporters are families who have faced their own struggles with poverty, illness, or other challenges that have taught them empathy for others in difficult circumstances." He paused before continuing. "Your strongest opponents are people whose social status depends on maintaining rigid boundaries between respectable and disreputable behavior. They view your acceptance as a threat to the social order that defines their own position in the community, and the people in between. They're waiting to see whether your reformation produces lasting change in your character and circumstances," Dr. Hartwell replied. "These are practical people who care more about results than theories. If you can demonstrate sustained commitment to Christian service and moral behavior, they'll gradually accept you as a legitimate member of the community." The conversation was interrupted by Samuel's arrival home from his afternoon pastoral visits, carrying the slightly weary expression of someone who had spent hours listening to other people's problems while managing his own ongoing challenges. "How were your visits today?" Margaret asked as she prepared coffee for the three of them. "Productive, but complicated," Samuel replied. "I spent 2 hours with the Mitchell family, whose son was injured in a mining accident last week. They're facing financial difficulties that the church could address, but there are concerns about whether they meet the moral standards that some donors expect for charitable recipients." The situation Samuel described was becoming increasingly common as Margaret's involvement in charitable work revealed the complex criteria that governed community assistance. Families in genuine need were sometimes denied help because their circumstances suggested moral failings, while less desperate families received support because their poverty reflected external circumstances rather than personal choices. "What kind of moral standards?" Dr. Hartwell asked with professional interest. "Joseph Mitchell was drinking when the accident occurred," Samuel explained. "Some congregation members argue that providing assistance would essentially reward irresponsible behavior and encourage others to be similarly careless. Margaret felt a surge of recognition and sympathy for the Mitchell family's situation. She understood how quickly circumstances could spiral beyond personal control and how moral judgments could prevent people from receiving help when they needed it most desperately. "What do you think we should do?" she asked Samuel, realizing that his answer would reveal important information about his approach to pastoral care and social responsibility. "I think we should help the family," Samuel replied without hesitation. Joseph Mitchell's drinking may have contributed to his accident, but his wife and children didn't make that choice and shouldn't suffer because of it. Besides, denying assistance to people who've made poor decisions contradicts everything Christ taught about forgiveness and redemption. His response revealed the theological convictions that had motivated his decision to marry Margaret, and it reinforced her growing respect for his commitment to practicing the mercy he preached, rather than simply talking about it in comfortable abstractions. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. "That's consistent with medical ethics as well. We treat patients based on their need for care, not on our judgment about how they acquired their condition." As the three of them discussed the Mitchell family's situation, Margaret realized that her trial period was serving purposes beyond simply proving her worthiness for community acceptance. It was also testing the congregation's commitment to Christian principles when those principles required them to extend mercy to people whose circumstances challenged their comfort with moral certainties. Evening brought the return of their comfortable domestic routine as Margaret and Samuel shared supper and discussed their respective activities during the day. These conversations had become more natural and intimate as they had learned to navigate the practical aspects of sharing a household while respecting each other's need for emotional privacy. "Margaret," Samuel said as they finished their meal, "I want you to know that your work with the charitable depot has impressed even some of your initial critics. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned today that the church's assistance to struggling families has become more effective since you began organizing the supplies and distribution." The compliment pleased Margaret more than she expected, partly because it suggested genuine progress toward acceptance, but mostly because it confirmed that her efforts were producing meaningful improvements in other people's lives. "Thank you for telling me that," she replied. "I've been worried that my involvement might be more burden than benefit for the church's charitable work." "Quite the opposite," Samuel assured her. "You've brought organizational skills and personal insight that we didn't have before. More importantly, you've demonstrated that reformation involves active service rather than passive respectability." As they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, maintaining the careful boundaries that preserved their emotional independence while respecting their legal commitment to each other, Margaret reflected on the progress she had made during her first 2 weeks as a minister's wife. The path toward community acceptance remained uncertain, with 4.5 months remaining in her trial period. But she had established herself as someone capable of meaningful contribution to church activities while maintaining the moral standards that her new position required. More importantly, she'd begun to rediscover aspects of her identity that had been suppressed during her years at the Silver Dollar. The intelligence, compassion, and organizational abilities that had characterized Margaret Ruby Callahan were emerging in Margaret Ruby Thornbrook, creating possibilities for a future that extended beyond simply escaping her past circumstances. The saloon girl who had begged for escape was becoming a minister's wife who could offer hope and practical assistance to others facing desperate situations. The transformation was incomplete and fragile, but it was genuine, and it was beginning to change not just Margaret's life, but the entire community's understanding of what redemption could accomplish when supported by patience, practical assistance, and the kind of love that manifested itself through daily commitment rather than romantic passion. 3 months into Margaret's trial period, on a bitter January morning when snow lay thick across the Colorado mountains. A crisis erupted that would test every alliance she had built and determine the ultimate success of her transformation. The trouble began with the arrival of Marcus Delacroix, a well-dressed stranger from Denver who claimed to represent parties seeking to recover debts from Margaret's previous life. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Margaret first learned of his presence when Mrs. Sarah Collins burst into the church basement where she was organizing winter clothing donations. Her face flushed with anxiety and her words tumbling over each other in urgent whispers. "Margaret, there's a man at Pemberton's asking questions about you," Sarah said, glancing around nervously. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that you owe money to people in Denver and that your marriage might be some kind of fraud to avoid paying legitimate debts." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow, though she had been expecting something like this since her wedding day. Silas Montgomery's business relationships extended throughout the Colorado Territory, and she had always known that her escape from the Silver Dollar might eventually attract attention from people who had financial interests in keeping women trapped in that life. "What exactly is he saying?" Margaret asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coursing through her. "He's claiming that you borrowed money from a Denver businessman for some kind of investment scheme, and that you disappeared from the Silver Dollar without paying it back," Sarah explained. "He says your marriage to Samuel might be an attempt to hide assets or gain legal protection from creditors." Before Margaret could respond, they were joined by Samuel, who had clearly received his own reports about the stranger's activities. "Margaret," he said without preamble, "I've just spoken with Judge Harrison about this man Delacroix. The judge is concerned that there might be legal implications if the debt claims are legitimate. Samuel, I need you to believe me when I tell you that I never had any business dealings with anyone in Denver beyond Montgomery's threats," Margaret said, looking directly into her husband's eyes. "I don't know who this man represents or why he's making these claims, but they're not based on any legitimate debts." Samuel's response was immediate and unequivocal. "I believe you completely. The question is how we prove your innocence to a community that's been looking for reasons to question your character." Their strategy session was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hartwell, whose expression suggested the crisis was more serious than they had initially understood. "I've just had a very disturbing conversation with Mr. Delacroix," the physician reported. "He's not just making vague accusations about unpaid debts. He has documents that he claims prove Margaret entered into a partnership agreement with a Denver businessman for establishing an entertainment enterprise in Deadwood Creek." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. Forged documents alleging business partnerships in the entertainment industry would directly attack her credibility and suggest that her entire reformation had been an elaborate deception. "Let me see these documents," Margaret said firmly. "If they exist, they're forgeries, and I might be able to identify evidence that proves their fraudulent nature." Dr. Hartwell shook his head grimly. "Delacroix is being very careful about who he shows the papers to. He's sharing them selectively with community leaders, while claiming that broader disclosure would damage innocent reputations." Outside the church, a crowd had gathered around Delacroix, who was standing on the steps of Pemberton's general store, reading from documents that he claimed proved Margaret's fraudulent intentions. "According to this partnership agreement," Delacroix announced in a voice that carried clearly through the cold air, "Mrs. Margaret Thornbrook, formerly known as Ruby May Callahan, agreed to establish a house of ill repute in Deadwood Creek, using funds advanced by my client." The crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile, with voices rising in anger and disappointment. "She deceived us all," someone shouted. "Playing the reformed sinner while planning to corrupt our community." Margaret watched her careful progress of 3 months crumbling as the crowd's mood shifted. From skepticism to active hostility. "I have to face them," Margaret said, moving toward the door despite Samuel and Dr. Hartwell's attempts to stop her. "Margaret, wait!" Samuel called out. Let me handle this. No, Margaret replied with firm conviction. If I let other people fight my battles, it confirms what they're saying about my character. I have to defend myself directly. She walked across the street toward the hostile crowd with steady determination. The conversation stopped as she approached, creating a silence heavy with anticipation. Mr. Delacroix, Margaret said clearly, I understand you have documents that allegedly prove I entered into business arrangements with someone in Denver. I'd like to examine those documents and respond to your accusations directly. Delacroix smiled with satisfaction. Mrs. Thornbrook, are you claiming that you have no knowledge of your partnership agreement with Mr. Theodore Blackwood for the establishment of an entertainment enterprise in this community? I'm claiming that any such documents are forgeries, Margaret replied without hesitation. I have never had any business relationship with Theodore Blackwood or anyone else in Denver. That's a very serious accusation, Delacroix said with mock concern. Are you suggesting that a respected Denver businessman would create false documents? Margaret had learned during her time at the Silver Dollar how to recognize manipulation and respond to it effectively. I'm suggesting that someone has created false documents for the purpose of destroying my marriage and discrediting the idea that women in desperate circumstances can genuinely reform their lives. Margaret replied boldly. Judge Harrison appeared at the edge of the crowd, apparently drawn by reports of the confrontation. His presence provided Margaret with an opportunity to shift the discussion from public accusations to legal proceedings. Judge Harrison, Margaret called out, Mr. Delacroix claims to have legal documents that prove I engaged in fraudulent business practices. I request a formal hearing where these documents can be examined by qualified experts. But before the judge could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension from the back of the crowd. That won't be necessary. Every head turned to see Silas Montgomery himself emerging from the crowd, his gold-toothed smile glinting in the winter sunlight. Behind him walked two men Margaret didn't recognize, and their coordinated appearance suggested this confrontation had been carefully orchestrated. Silas, Margaret breathed, understanding immediately that this had been his plan all along. Hello, Ruby May, Montgomery said, using her former name deliberately. Or should I say, Mrs. Thornbrook. Though I'm afraid that marriage might not be as legitimate as everyone believes. Samuel stepped forward, protectively. What are you implying, Montgomery? Montgomery's smile widened. I'm implying that your wife never properly settled her debts to me before leaving my establishment. According to territorial law, contracts signed by unmarried women remain binding even after marriage, unless the husband formally assumes responsibility for those debts. Dr. Hartwell frowned. That contract was settled when Samuel paid your termination fees. But did he pay all of them? Montgomery produced a thick document from his coat. You see, there were additional expenses that accrued after Ruby May's departure. Damages to my establishment's reputation, lost revenue from her sudden absence, compensation to the gentleman from Denver who had paid in advance for her exclusive services. Margaret felt the trap closing around her, but her voice remained steady. Those charges are fraudulent, and you know it. Are they? Montgomery's expression grew predatory. Mr. Delacroix here represents Mr. Blackwood, who paid me substantial money for the exclusive right to relocate you to his Denver establishment. When you married instead, you cost him a significant investment. The crowd murmured with growing hostility as the web of accusations grew more complex. Margaret realized that Montgomery had spent months planning this moment, creating a network of false debts and forged documents designed to destroy her new life. But then, from the church steps behind her, Reverend McKinnon's voice rang out with unexpected authority. Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Delacroix, I believe this charade has gone on long enough. The elderly pastor descended the steps, carrying a leather satchel, his stern expression more determined than Margaret had ever seen it. You see, McKinnon continued, when Mr. Delacroix first appeared in our community, I took the liberty of telegraphing colleagues in Denver to inquire about his alleged client. Mr. Theodore Blackwood. He opened his satchel and withdrew several documents. I learned some very interesting things. First, that no businessman named Theodore Blackwood exists in Denver's commercial district. Second, that Mr. Delacroix has been previously arrested for fraud in 3 different territories. The crowd's attention shifted from Margaret to the accusers as McKinnon continued his revelation. But, most interesting of all, the pastor said, I discovered that Mr. Montgomery has been attempting to intimidate former employees in multiple communities, trying to force them back into his service through false debt claims. Montgomery's confident expression began to crumble as McKinnon produced telegram after telegram, documenting his previous schemes. The truth, McKinnon declared to the assembled crowd, is that Mrs. Thornbrook's reformation is so genuine and her escape from Montgomery's establishment so complete that he has resorted to criminal fraud in an attempt to reclaim what he considers his property. Margaret stared at her former critic in amazement. The man who had questioned her worthiness for 3 months had been quietly conducting his own investigation to protect her from exactly this kind of attack. Judge Harrison stepped forward with grim determination. Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Delacroix, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted extortion. As the territorial marshal emerged from the crowd to place the 2 men in custody, Montgomery's mask of respectability finally slipped completely. You think this is over? He snarled at Margaret. You think you can just walk away from what you are? You'll always be a whore, no matter what name you hide behind. The vicious words hung in the cold air for a moment, before Samuel stepped forward with controlled fury. Mr. Montgomery, he said quietly, you are speaking about my wife, a woman who has demonstrated more courage, integrity, and Christian virtue in 3 months than you've shown in your entire miserable existence. But it was Margaret herself who delivered the final response, her voice carrying across the silent crowd with absolute conviction. You're wrong. Silas, she said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. I was never what you tried to make me. I was always Margaret Ruby Callahan, a woman temporarily trapped by circumstances beyond her control. And now I'm Margaret Ruby Thornbrook, a minister's wife who has learned that redemption isn't just possible. It's inevitable for anyone brave enough to accept help when it's offered. As Montgomery and Delacroix were led away in shackles, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many members approached Margaret with expressions of apology and genuine respect. Mrs. Sarah Collins was the first. Margaret, I'm ashamed that any of us doubted you. Your character has been evident in everything you've done for this community. Even Mrs. Victoria Morrison, who had been among Margaret's harshest critics, approached with grudging admiration. Mrs. Thornbrook, your dignity under attack has been remarkable. I may not have approved of your past, but I cannot question your present conduct. But it was Reverend McKinnon's words that moved Margaret most deeply. My dear, the elderly pastor said gently, I owe you an apology. I spent 3 months testing your faith when I should have been celebrating God's power to transform lives. Your reformation has taught this entire community what true Christianity looks like in practice. As the crowd finally dispersed, Margaret stood with Samuel and Dr. Hartwell in the winter sunshine, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Your 6-month trial period is over, Samuel said softly. But I think the vote of confidence was unanimous. Margaret looked around at the community that had become her home, seeing faces that now showed acceptance, respect, and genuine affection for the woman she had become. No, she replied with a smile that came from the deepest place in her heart. My trial period ended the day you said you'd make me respectable. Everything since then has just been proving to everyone else what you saw in me from the beginning. Dr. Hartwell chuckled. And what was that? Margaret turned to her husband, her friend, and her community with the confidence of someone who had finally come home after a very long journey. That respectability isn't something you're born with or something you lose forever. It's something you choose every day through your actions and your commitment to becoming worthy of the love and trust that others place in you. As they walked back toward their modest home on Elm Street, Margaret reflected on the miraculous transformation that had begun with a desperate plea in a smoky saloon and culminated in complete acceptance by a community that had learned to see past her. History to her character. The saloon girl who had begged for escape was truly gone now, replaced by a minister's wife who had proven that redemption was not just a theological concept, but a practical reality that could transform individuals, marriages, and entire communities willing to embrace the radical power of second chances. 6 months later, as Margaret stood before the church congregation, announcing the establishment of a charitable foundation to help women escape desperate circumstances, she realized that her story was no longer about running from her past, but about using her experiences to create hope for others facing similar darkness. The preacher's son, who had offered to make her respectable, had kept his promise. But more than that, he had helped her discover that she had always possessed the strength to make herself worthy of respect, love, and the kind of future that honors both the pain of the past and the infinite possibilities of tomorrow. In the end, respectability had never been about hiding from who she used to be. It had been about courageously becoming who she was always meant to be, and helping others find the same transformative path from desperation to dignity, from survival to service, and from begging for escape to offering hope to those still trapped in circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. The story that had begun with 5 desperate words in a Colorado saloon had become a testament to the truth that no one is ever too lost to be found, too broken to be healed, or too fallen to be lifted up by love that sees past present circumstances to eternal possibilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.